Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the sculptor Rodin and then 19th century architecture. Starting with Rodin, Auguste Rodin is a figure who is hard to categorize. Some suggest that he's more of a realist, others that he is more of an impressionist, but he's a sculptor that was regarded in his lifetime and afterwards to be on par with Michelangelo. Here we see a photograph of Rodin by the famous American photographer Edward Steichen. Rodin was born in a working class district in Paris and failed actually to gain admission to the École des Beaux-Arts, the main academy of art in Paris, several times. And so he decided to go instead to the Petite École, which was a school for more decorative arts training rather than fine arts training. He worked in the decorative arts for the next 20 years, eventually working in other sculptor studios and struggling to become recognized as an independent sculptor himself. He did finally get to exhibit some work, and when he did, one of them was bought by the French government, and they liked it enough that they honored him with a major commission. The government asked him to design a set of bronze doors for a museum of decorative arts that they were planning to build. He was free to choose his own theme for the doors, so he used Dante's Divine Comedy. In Dante's lengthy poem, an ordinary man, presumably Dante himself, is allowed to visit the souls in hell, purgatory, and paradise. During this voyage, he has two guides. The Roman poet Virgil, known for writing the Aeneid, leads him through hell and purgatory, and then finally the beautiful Beatrice introduces him to paradise. Rodin decides to focus on the section of hell, and this is supposed to be specifically the second circle, which is devoted to sins of lust. As you can see, by giving it the title The Gates of Hell, he intends to relate it to Ghiberti's The Gates of Paradise, which we talked about earlier in the course. If we compare Rodin and Ghiberti's works, we see that unlike Ghiberti's very carefully organized composition with separate panels for separate stories, Rodin's image is far more fluid, right? It's basically one giant scene rather than separately blocked out scenes. You can also see that the level of relief, the degree of relief, is much higher in the Rodin than it is in the image by Ghiberti. And so we see the contrast of paradise and hell, order and chaos in that way. We see this sense of chaos, instability, swirling throughout the scene, and generally this sense of a tragic view of the human condition. If we look closely at some of the details, you can see kind of the writhing bodies and just how far out they project from the doors themselves. He originally tries to persuade the government to let him flank the gates with the statues of Adam and Eve seen here. The doors then become a reenactment of the sufferings of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, of course, known for the sins of temptation and the prologue of the original sin, that when the Adam and Eve, after the fall pictured here, are taken away from the doors, we lose the sense then of the salvation that comes after, right, of Christ, and instead are left just with the failures of humanity. The figure of Adam was transformed instead into the three shades at the top, the same figure seen here from different angles. This is a project that, when it was announced finished in 1885, he said the doors were ready to be cast. The government said that, well, in fact, the plans for the museum had been canceled. So he continued to work on it until his death, but they were never sort of installed because, of course, the museum was never built. And they were only finally cast in bronze after his death. In this process, he creates many full-scale figures from some of the smaller ones. And as you can see, in the main area above the door, you'll probably recognize the thinker, probably one of Rodin's most famous sculptures. The thinker sits above the door, where in a medieval tympanum would usually sit Jesus Christ. But instead of acting out the last judgment, it's now an everyman who thinks. There's a lot of questions surrounding what the significance of this figure is, and no one really has a concrete answer. Does he represent Dante, meditating on what he has seen? Is he more generically just thinking man, or some kind of allegory of thought, allegory of creativity or conscience? The fact that the figure is so heavily muscled and the facial features suggest a kind of worker, suggests that his powerful build and superior physique might express the concept that thought is a higher form of being. Whatever way it is interpreted, we see him secularizing, on the one hand, a religious subject, and on the other hand, showing this figure that is contemplating humanity, right, in whatever guise. And this sense of psychological angst or psychological struggle is something that pervades a lot of Rodin's works. Another one, for example, is the Burghers of Calais. This is another commission by the government of the town of Calais, who wanted to erect this monument to these burghers. Burgher, not of course like a hamburger, but a wealthy citizen of a town. That's what that word means. This is a story, part of their history, from 1347, so over 500 years before that. The King of England had laid siege to the French town of Calais, and basically that means that they've surrounded the walled-in city, and they're not letting any supplies in, hoping to starve them out. The city surrenders, and part of that is basically these 6 men are required to walk out of the city to the English, bearing the keys of the city, right? And these were actually recorded conditions that were chronicled by a historian. Basically, the English said that the hostages had to be barefoot and in sackcloth. They had to have ropes around their necks bearing the keys to the city and the fortress, and that the king was essentially free to do with them as he pleased. So it was understood that they were essentially walking to their deaths. Because of these historical details, because they're meant to be barefoot and in sackcloth, Rodin could avoid the problem of period costume, right, of making them in sort of medieval garb, which makes them more universal and more sort of relatable to us. He has this unusual task of creating a monument that honors a group rather than an individual. And what he decides to do is concentrate on the individual response of each member of the group. So they are kind of self-absorbed, right? We see a lot of complex emotions and various reactions. The figure on the far right in the back puts his hands over his head. The figure on the right in the front, you can really see, shows his mouth downturned, really looking sad and upset. Other figures gesture, and they're not walking together kind of arm in arm to fulfill their duty. They're really pacing, right? They're going in this circular motion back and forth, having to deal with the sort of real sacrifice that they're being asked to make, or that they decide to make. And to some degree, I think it makes it all the more heroic and meaningful to see them struggling with this decision that they've made. Because we know that in the end they do in fact do it, right? So the fact that they're acknowledging sort of the real human emotion and the cost that they're willing to, and the sacrifice that they're willing to make for their town, is significant. This is a monument, but rather than being high on a pedestal, Rodin puts it on a very low pedestal, essentially right in our space, in the viewer space. And the viewer is meant to essentially walk around the image to see all of the different figures. The finish is also not the kind of bright, shiny finish of polished marble, but a much rougher finish of heavily patinaed bronze. So Rodin, sculptor, sort of uncategorizable. Let's move on then to 19th century architecture. Our stylistic period is 1800 to 1900. And unlike a lot of the architectural styles that we've seen so far, there's no one unified style, right? So a lot of, when we talk about Gothic architecture, it all looks roughly the same. Or if we talk about Renaissance architecture, it looks all roughly the same, or Rococo. But architecture in the 19th century, essentially, instead of developing a style of their own, they looked back to history as a wealth of sources to choose from. And this is what we might call historicism. So we see them building in a Gothic style, or a classical style, or a Baroque style, for various different buildings, rather than having a kind of signature style of its own. The sense of kind of this eclectic use of different historical styles in historicism basically went on for the majority of the century, until at the very end the reform movements turned to nature for inspiration instead of history, right? So instead of looking to historical styles, they looked to nature for the forms that architecture should take. And this is especially well seen in Art Nouveau. We also see during this period new building materials, specifically iron and steel, being used, and new building types, right? So unlike, very wealthy palaces for kings and queens, or elaborate churches, here we see building types that are typically funded by the state, by the government, and they're for the upper middle class public. So we see libraries and museums, opera houses, and buildings for world's fairs. We also see during this time period the development of prefabricated architecture, basically where the aspects of the materials of the architecture are created in factories ahead of time and then shipped to the site. And we also see in America the birth of the skyscraper. Let's start with historicism, though. Like I said, in most of the 19th century, architects would pick and choose between a variety of different historical precedents, choosing those elements that might best fit either the purpose of the building, right, its function, or a sense of nationalism, right, that there's a sense of looking back to the history of your nation, your country's architecture, and seeing sort of what is characteristic about it. We're going to start with the Houses of Parliament in London, in England. And so this is, of course, an example of historicism in England. The Houses of Parliament burned down in 1834 and had to be rebuilt and redesigned the following year. And they celebrate England's medieval heritage with this clearly neo-Gothic building, right? We see the use of towers that remind us of Gothic cathedrals. We see these buttresses on the exterior that look vaguely like flying buttresses. We see the pointed arches of the windows and the lancet windows inside, and the proliferation of architectural sculpture on sort of decorative sculpture on the exterior. On the interior as well, we see these large clerestories and vaulted ceilings, all of which point to the England's medieval heritage in having sort of a Gothic structure. They also saw in medieval architecture a sense of moral purity and spiritual authenticity in the craftsmanship of medieval artisans who built these great cathedrals, right? And they see this in reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which was flooding the market with cheaply made, poorly designed, mass-produced, machine-made goods. And they were nostalgic for this sense of hand craftsmanship that they saw as being part of the medieval period. In France, in Paris, so bouncing back to France, We see also urban planning kind of taking hold. There's a massive rebuilding or reorganization of the city that is spurred by Napoleon III, a different Napoleon than the one we talked about earlier, who also declares himself emperor, this time in 1851. And he hires the architect, the Baron Georges Haussmann, to overhaul the city of Paris. And we call this sort of overhaul Haussmannization, right, after him. Basically, he does this for a variety of reasons. First, he wants to make this sort of imperial statement, creating these wide open boulevards that connect the major monuments together. But more practically, he also wants to help prevent more revolutions in France, right? More rebellions, because these were typically created by putting up barricades in the tiny sort of medieval winding streets of old Paris. And so what he does is essentially bulldoze through them, and you can see that kind of in the image on the left here. You can see the huge boulevard that sort of runs through the old city. And in doing so, he makes it much more difficult to barricade, right? Because these are now streets that are much wider. And he allows for the movement of troops around the city in a much more easy fashion with these large boulevards as well. But that's not all he does. He also starts to change the kind of fabric of the city by renovating it, right? So while they're doing all of this construction, he puts in new water and sewer systems, centralized train stations, and gas street lamps, right? This is essentially when Paris becomes the city of lights. He also moves the wealthy bourgeoisie to the center of town and moves the poor to the periphery, to the outside of the city, in essentially a massive gentrification program that, again, is meant to sort of dissipate some of the rebellious forces. His preferred style is what we might call Beaux-Arts architecture, named after the École des Beaux-Arts, which tended to kind of blend Renaissance and Baroque aspects together. He created this very strict building code that regulated the facades or the faces of the buildings that face the street, and made sure that they essentially match in height and in the height also of each specific level. And as you can see on the right-hand image, all of the buildings, therefore, that were built afterwards tend to follow this very strict building code, so that if you've ever been to Paris, it's an extraordinarily uniform city. Everything looks very much the same. And this is all done on purpose, but it gives it a very sort of characteristic architectural quality. The end of one of these boulevards was built the Paris Opera House, right, by Charles Garnier. This is an example of historicism in France. This time he uses neo-Baroque, and it kind of makes sense because this is in fact a theater, and so it makes sense to use a style that's associated with the theatrical and the dramatic. Garnier wins this commission to build the opera house and essentially builds it on roughly classical principles, right? It's very symmetrical, for example, but he also includes extensive interior and exterior ornamentation. This is built also during the Second Empire, right? The period under Napoleon III. And so he creates this conception of the opera as a stage not only for opera, but as a stage for Second Empire society. So it's a space for the spectacle of public gathering, of seeing and being seen. And the architecture expresses this function. If you look at the exterior, you can see how it somehow expresses what's going on the interior. In the front section, what takes up almost a third of the building is the entrance spaces, right? So going from left to right on the top image, you can see that the first third of the building is for the grand staircase and the reception spaces, the entrance to the building. That's this huge hall where people can look out over the balconies and see people as they're coming in. And it was thought that this was almost as much of the importance of going to the opera as anything else. The second space that you see that on the exterior has a dome over it is the theater seating area. And then the third space has that has this kind of pediment roof over it that's higher than the rest of the building, is where the stage is located, right? And it's higher so that they can bring the sets up and down through this extensive fly system. And then finally in the back there are rehearsal spaces and office spaces. The rehearsal space actually has a kind of seedy history to it. This is where the dancers would go to rehearse, but there was actually this secret viewing area where rich men could go and watch the dancers rehearse and kind of pick them out for possible mistresses, right? So that's going to kind of cloud our understanding in our next lecture, Impressionism, about Degas and his images of dancers. Here are some details of the interior. The top two are the entrance spaces, right? The grand staircase where you can see these balconies overlooking this huge hall where people could flow in and out, and then the kind of more majestic spaces on the front. And then the two images below are the theater seating area and the stage. And this is just to give you a greater sense of the kind of opulence of the building. Now the building itself is made of iron, right? The way that it's held up is through iron construction, but which is a modern building material, but he doesn't want to show that it's made of iron, so he covers everything under marble, right? Under sort of an extensive amount of marble facade. And so we're going to see then in the next image an example of architecture that shows the materials that it's made out of. This is Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, built in London, England in the 1850s. And this is a building that was commissioned to house the World's Fair, this great exhibition of technological progress that was happening in England. And there were a series of many more throughout the rest of the century. And basically, it's kind of like the Olympics of industry and technology, right? Nations across Europe and America send their best technological and industrial devices to sort of compete with each other. And it's set up a little bit like Disney's Epcot, where you go around to different nations' areas inside the building to see their work. And certainly Epcot comes from this heritage of World's Fairs. The World's Fair's buildings were designed to be temporary. It's like an exceptionally elaborate circus tent that they're putting up here. And in 1850, the people kind of that were part of the commissioning group, right, the people who were in charge of getting this together, were behind in their schedule. So they turned to this man, Joseph Paxton, who was essentially known for building greenhouses on country estates. He was sort of a horticulturalist and architect. And these were essentially constructions of iron and glass. And basically, that's what the Crystal Palace is. It is essentially a giant greenhouse. It covers something like 18 acres, and what was so remarkable about it and so revolutionary about it is that it is what we call an undraped building, right? There's no overlay of a historical style. It's just bare iron and glass construction, right? And this comes from a kind of realist impulse that encouraged architects to honestly express a building's purpose and support system, right? To not disguise it with sort of marble covering. So this allows the building to be constructed with prefabricated parts. If you look closely at the windows, you can see that they're all identical. So he would have had the iron and glass made not on site, right, at some factory, shipped to the site. They're all identical. It's what we call modular construction. And basically, he then clicked it together like some sort of Lego project, right? It's a very sort of a simple and fast way to construct it. And it was put up in the incredibly fast span of 6 months, which was seen as this kind of architectural, technological marvel, right? To showcase essentially this fair of technology. Again, there's no sort of historical overlay, although the basic design of the building suggests a kind of basilica, right? We see a kind of barrel vaulted quality to it. The building was so popular that when it was dismantled at the end of the World's Fair, where it was located in Hyde Park, it was re-erected in a new location on the outskirts of London and stayed there until 1936 when it was destroyed by fire. You can see here just the vastness of the Crystal Palace, and then these paintings and prints done of the interior, right? And so you can see the different nations' flags in different areas, but you can also see just how open the image was, or the architecture was, that all of the iron and glass was just bare, and it had no real coverings to them. It was just very sort of cleanly expressed in that way. This system of having kind of this large central hall with these various levels of shops and areas on the sides will eventually turn into the modern mall and department store. It was for another one of these World's Fairs, this time the Paris World's Fair of 1889, that another such structure was developed, this time by Gustave Eiffel, right? And of course, this is the Eiffel Tower. He's an engineer slash architect who also, by the way, designed the interior armature for the Statue of Liberty that was sculpted by someone else. This was seen as a symbol of technological progress. At over 900 feet tall, it was for a while the world's tallest structure. And the transparency of the structure blurs the distinction between interior and exterior in a really visionary way that becomes important for 20th century architecture. Towards the end of the century, particularly in the 1890s, we start to see a rejection of historicism in favor of turning to abstracted patterns from nature for inspiration. There was this concept that ornamentation also shouldn't be just simply applied to the surface, right? As in perhaps the Paris Opera, but that should function as part of the structure itself. And so we see here in Art Nouveau the use of iron and its ability to be cast as a way to meld decoration and structural support. They also created essentially what were total works of art. That everything, every detail from the fixtures to the tile to the lighting to the furniture was designed by the architect to achieve a unified aesthetic. And so this aesthetic is characterized by the swirling linear style that's based on these twining, curling tendrils of vines and plants. So we see in the image on the right this same motif that's through the tile work of the floor, on the wall surfaces, in the iron sort of supports of the staircase, in the balustrade of the staircase, in the shape of the staircase itself, in this way. We see on the exterior, right, on the facade, the way that the columns also have these kind of growing forms coming out. And you can just see in the upper left corner the use of this iron also, again, with these plant-like forms, and the stained glass window, all of which kind of work together. And here's another image from a different part of the interior. As you can see, every single piece of the architecture working together in this unified aesthetic. Finally, we turn to 19th century architecture in the United States, and we have the birth of the American skyscraper. the development of the skyscraper was in fact generally practical, right? The increased property values in cities that are based on the plot of land made it more cost efficient to start building up. There's only so far you can build up before you need a way of getting people up and down, right? Because there's only so many stairs people can climb on a daily basis. So the skyscraper is made possible also by the invention of the elevator. This is the Guarantee, also known as the Prudential Building, in Buffalo, New York, by Louis Henry Sullivan from the 1890s. And Sullivan has been called the first truly modern architect. We see that he also tends to synthesize structure and ornamentation, but this company is an insurance company. So this is not a palace or an opera house or a church. This is a simple office building. And he uses the latest technologies to create light-filled, well-ventilated spaces. He's known for this famous phrase, form follows function, right? And in his essay, The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered, from 1896, he argues that the exterior should be an expression of interior function. And in his office buildings, they usually have three parts. The base, as you can see, is differently decorated, and that contains the public commercial spaces, the lobby, etc. The very top contains the mechanical plants, the water tanks, the sort of elevator mechanisms, etc. And so you see that that's different. And then in the middle, right, this sort of grid of identical spaces in the middle were the offices, right, which all look alike because they all are alike, he says. And so the structure of the building is, and the function of the different parts of the building are kind of shown on the exterior. The structure of this building is steel, but it's sheathed with terracotta, which is fireproof, which is why they did it, but it also can be decorated because it's essentially clay, so it can be easily molded. If we look at this building from a distance, it seems very kind of geometric, very sort of modern and plain. And you see it in the context, for example, of downtown Buffalo with these like huge Victorian kind of historicist buildings in the foreground. It does seem, in fact, exceptionally modern. It was kind of known for that. But if we take a really close look, if we zoom in fact, the terracotta that covers the building is extremely ornately decorated, right? Every inch of it has this decoration that's based in nature, using these floral and vegetal motifs. We see, for example, on the left that the corner of the cornice has this sort of tree motif, and the decoration is not only on the exterior, but also on the interior as well. And it was all designed by Sullivan himself. All of his work tends to emphasize this vertical. And again, he was seen as being, in the 20th century, people looked back on his work and saw it as being very modern, and they took the idea of form follows function to mean something more mechanistic, right? Something more sort of geometric in conception, and that's what they end up doing with it, as we'll see later. But if we read this quote from Sullivan, right, the full quote from Form Ever Follows Function, then we get a stronger sense of where he was coming from. It says, "Whether it be the eagle in its flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and that is the law." And so we see here that his conception of architecture and his conception of form follows function was actually organic and coming from nature rather than sort of geometric and mechanical, as we'll see it kind of develops into in the 20th century. So to summarize, there's no single style in architecture in the 19th century. We see a number of revival styles, this historicist take of neo-Gothic, neo-Baroque, etc. We see the development of new building materials, particularly iron and steel, that allow for new forms. And then at the end of the century, this turn to nature for inspiration for decoration and structure. All right, that's it.